Hello everyone, so there isn't a single Grandmaster left who can stand up to Sindarov in this candidates tournament. It's incredible. He has gained such confidence in his play, but certainly also a psychological dominance over his opponents. Let's take a look at his game of the day against the Chinese player Yi Wei. So Sindarov with black, we're going to experience the game from his perspective. E4 is played by Yi Wei, E5. And here Yi Wei plays knight C3, which is called the Vienna opening. It's a rather defensive move, defending e4, and we come to control the d5 square, the usual move being more often knight f3 to attack the pawn of 5. But here, Yi Wei played knight to c3. Here, Sindarov plays king d6, the same thing, and bishop c4. The bishop positions itself dangerously on this diagonal. We know that the attack on the pawn f7 in the opening is always a tricky attack for black to handle, because only the king defends this pawn. It's a rather fragile pawn. But that doesn't scare Sindarov, who plays knight to f6. And now, white continue with d3, which seems logical. We create this pawn structure, we defend the bishop, and we free the other one. But this gives Sindarov an opportunity which he is not going to let slip by. Here, most beginners would continue developing their pieces. We tell beginners not to move the same piece multiple times in the opening, and even less to put a knight on the edge. And yet, Sindarov is going to play the knight to a5. So why this move? Sindarov doesn't want to miss the chance to take the bishop on the white square, because in reality, the bishop on the white square can't avoid the exchange. If it comes to b5, there would be the c6 push, and on bishop a4, b5. And the bishop would have to come to b3, where it would be exchanged by the knight and the presence of the pawn. c6 could even support the advance to d5. So that would be a rather favorable sequence for black. So white choose to play a 3, and of course, you must not give the bishop time to retreat to a 2, so Sindarov exchanges immediately. Recapture on c4. And now it's Sindarov, who will place his bishop on c5 on this dangerous diagonal, while white no longer have theirs. Yi Wei continues with knight to f3, d6, and now Yi Wei. He doesn't play bishop g5 immediately. He will prepare this move with queen to d3. On bishop g5, black could play h6. Question the bishop. If it retreats to h4 to maintain the pin, even playing g5 actually, because you can bring out the bishop, for example, to g4, and with black look to do a queenside castling. And the h-pawn will come to chase the bishop and even try to trap it actually. With an attack on the white kingside castling, if the king does a kingside castling, that's why in this position, Sindarov did not prevent the bishop from coming to g5. And why Yi Wei didn't rush into it. He builds up first and plays queen d3, and you'll see that this creates a threat, bishop g5 in a very clever way. Sindarov plays bishop e6, and now Yi Hui bishop g5, the pin. In the databases, there is a record of 6 games with this position. 4 wins for white, 1 draw, and only 1 win for black. Because most players with black continued with h6, but since the queen is on d3, h6 is no longer a good move. That's not what Sindarov played. He was precise right to the end. But let me show you why h6 no longer works now. Because after h6, white will now take the knight. They won't retreat, they'll take this knight. And then queen recaptures and the b4 push follows. Now, the bishop has to choose between the squares on b6 and d4, and neither of the 2 squares works. If it goes to b6, that's the worst. The c5 push, which will win the bishop. And now we understand why the presence of the queen is necessary. Because in case of an exchange, there's queen b5, the fork. That was the whole subtlety of Yi Wei's position with this move queen d3. And if the bishop doesn't retreat to b6 but goes to d4, we can exchange. Then, after knight b5, which threatens the fork on c7 and attacks the pawn on d4 twice. So you get it, bishop. Now g5 doesn't fear this push to h6, because there will be an exchange on f6, then the push to b4, which will allow white to win material. And that's why Sindarov inserts the move of 5. Knight d5 is played. And here, we would all probably take that knight on d5, but not Sindarov. He's going to play c6, he pushes back the knight, so knight for f6, check, pawn takes, and bishop h4. And so there's a destruction, you can notice doubled pawns, an isolated pawn here, some weak squares. But Sindarov bases his strategy on dynamic play. He has the pair of bishops, he has the bishop on a white square, and the g-file has just opened up for him. So that always makes white think about a possible Kingside castling. When a file is open against you, it means the rooks will be able to attack. And by the way, Sindarov immediately brings the rook. That way, at least, it's clear. Li Wei isn't intimidated by this. Position of the rook on the file. Any kingside castling. Sindarov plays a4. If b4 is pushed, there will be the en passant. And that's what happens, by the way, before en passant recapture. Now, it's possible to win the pawn on a3. But Sindarov will prefer to play bishop g4. b4 is played, attacking the bishop on the black square. Bishop takes on f3, threatening rook takes on g2. That's a stronger threat, so the bishop on the white square must be eliminated. Queen takes. And now the bishop on the black square moves to d4, attacking the rook on a1. And now something important is about to happen in the game. You know, this is a long game. Both players have about 2 hours to play this game. And in this position, Eway with white will think for almost 50 minutes about this move before deciding to have the bishop take on f6. And so all this time spent calculating this move will cruelly be missed later on when he finds himself in time trouble. So of course, bishop takes on f6, it seems logical. After all, you win a pawn and attack the queen. But the follow-up isn't so obvious because you'll see that white have weaknesses to defend. Bishop takes on f6, queen to d7. And now the rook on a1 needs to be saved. It has to be moved. So Sindarov is down a pawn, but he has the king in the center. And yet, if you use analysis engines, computers, they'll tell you that the position of black is promising. It is in no way inferior. Why? Because in reality, the lost pawn can be recovered. You can put a lot of pressure on the position of white. That is, here, the rook on a1 is attacked, but the pawn on a3 is also being targeted. There is pressure on g2, there is this pin on f2, this bishop, which can sometimes also be attacked, and even the pawn on e4, and even the pawn on c4. You see, everything I just highlighted in black, or rather in red, these are possibilities for action for black that can be illustrated through different variations. I'll show you. In the position, it's rook to d1 that was played. But let's imagine that white play rook to a2 to keep double protection of the pawn on a3. There would be queen to e6, which attacks the pawn on c4. And if white play, for example, rook to c1 to defend it, b5 with the pin. And if it's the rook on c2 that comes to defend, thinking that the queen protects the pawn on a 3, then rook to g6 comes to double the attacks, bishop to h4 and queen to g4. We attack the bishop, we threaten queen takes queen since the pawn on g2 is pinned, and in case of an exchange, the bishop is attacked, the pawn on e4 is attacked, and even the pawn on a3. You see what I was telling you, there is a lot of pressure all over the board, which means that black will eventually recover the pawn with a piece placement that is ultimately superior to that of white. And that's not easy to realize at the start of the sequence. So Wei Yi here played rook d1. So queen to e6, pressure on the bishop, attack on the pawn on c4, and it's always the same here. White start to come and defend the c4 pawn with rook to c1. There will be rook. g6, attacking the bishop, and as soon as the bishop retreats, we will be able to use the g4 square to attack the bishop and the pawn. That's why Yiwei plays h3. He deprives black of that g4 square. In addition, he frees up a little h2 square for himself, but that gives up the pawn. So queen takes on c4. Rook to d3, white also defend the pawn on a3 laterally. The queen returns to e6, rook to d1. Rook to g6, the bishop is attacked twice. It retreats to h4, and you can see that black can no longer use that g4 square. kf8 is played, and this is amusing what Sindarov is about to do. Sindarov, watch this. Queen h5 attacks the pawn on h7, but king g8, and finally the king finds shelter with these moves king f8 and king g8. As if he had kingside castling, but still the pawn on g7 is missing. White play rh1, stepping out of the line with the rook and out of the line with the bishop, because the pawn on g2 and the pawn on f2 were pinned pawns. c5 is played. It's true that the black king is missing a pawn, so it's less well protected than the white king. But in the end, the black pieces are better placed to attack the white king. You see the rook on the file, the bishop on the diagonal, and the white pieces can't get close to the black king. Whereas on the queen side, on the other side, there is some pressure. This pressure from a 3, this possibility of creating, why not, a passed pawn on the queen side. White play f4. They are trying to energize their play, to open lines on the king side, capture on f4. Queen f3 to attack the pawn. Rook e8, counterattack on the pawn on d4. Bishop f2, bishop takes on f2. Queen takes on f2, queen takes on a4. And here it's a critical moment because Yi Wei is going to make a mistake. He will give a decisive advantage to Sindarov, but honestly, it's not easy to know how to play with white. What would you do in this position? Would you take on c5, on d6, or would you play another move? What to do here with white? And you'll see that it's really not easy to understand what should be done in white's place. I invite you to pause the video. So what would you have done? Here, Yi Wei played rook, takes d6, and this move is completely losing. Let's see why. In reality, it was necessary to exchange on c5 and not take the pawn on c5 because there is still a mating threat. But you had to play rook f3 to intercept the attacks on g2, threaten the pawn on f4, also threaten the pawn on c5 now, and maintain control of the third rank, the defense of a3, and especially the defense of the square on e3. Look at what he played. Yi Wei, he didn't take this pawn on c5. Then the move rook f3, he took the pawn on d6. But then rook takes d6, rook takes. And since there is no control over the square e3, Sindarov uses it to play queen e3. If taken, of course, the pawn will recapture, and this passed pawn propelled by the rook behind it is decisive in this endgame. That's why Yi Wei doesn't take. He plays queen f3. He especially doesn't want to create a passed pawn by exchanging on e3. But as a result, the c pawn, which hasn't been eliminated, can play c4, and black create a passed pawn on the other side. Queen g4, check. King f8, rook d1. The pawn advances more and more dangerously. It's only 2 squares away from promotion, and the queen still controls the square of promotion. Queen g5. f3, offering an exchange of queens. Because Sindarov understood that without the queens, he would win this endgame. And then in addition, the queen, after the push to f3, will control the square h6, so that there can't be a check on h6 either. That could happen against the black king. And the queen also controls the square c5, so the white queen can't attack the black king. There is an exchange of queens, queen takes, rook takes, and resignation from Yi Wei, who understands that this finale is totally lost. Why? Because there's going to be this pawn push to c2. The rook should start, then the black rook can play rook e2, rook d2, rook d1, and that wins. I'll show you, for example, if white take on f3, c2, rook c1, rook e2. The rook traps the king on the first rank. The king can try to approach, but rook d2 and nothing stops rook d1 anymore. That would be a fork. If the white rook takes, the pawn will recapture, and that would be a queen. And if the white rook doesn't take, it's the black rook that will capture. And there's no way to prevent this arrival of the rook on d1, actually. So it's become completely winning. So what did you think of this display of domination in this tournament, in this candidates tournament by Sindarov? Let's take a look at the standings. So as you can see, Sindarov is still in the lead, but he has increased his advantage since he now has 5.5 points compared to 4 for Caruana. Caruana in the last round, in the 6th round, didn't manage to win. He made a draw. It's going to be very difficult to catch up with Sindarov for first place. We're almost done with the first half of the matches this week. There will be the return matches next week. And at the end of next week, we'll know who will be the challenger for the World Championship final against Gukesh. For the world title, you can leave me likes, comments, share the video, and support the channel. We'll see each other soon for new adventures on the chessboard. Goodbye, everyone.